The first time a Japanese fighter pilot watched an American plane fall from the sky, he didn't feel triumph. He felt confusion. The aircraft was burning, spiraling downward in a long trail of smoke. Yet it did not break apart the way he expected. It kept flying longer than seemed possible. Wings shuddering, engine coughing, as if the machine itself refused to surrender. That image stayed with him long after he landed, long after the cheering on the radio faded. Before the war, instructors had told him that American pilots were careless, dependent on technology, and lacking the disciplined spirit of the Imperial Airmen. But the man who had flown that doomed aircraft had not behaved like someone weak or careless. He had fought the sky itself until gravity finally won, and that unsettled something deep inside the pilot who watched it happen. In the early months of the Pacific War, Japanese aviators entered combat with an almost sacred confidence. They believed they were heirs to a warrior tradition stretching back centuries, and their training emphasized aggression, sacrifice, and individual skill. They had studied American planes on paper, laughed at their size and weight. Too heavy, many said. Too slow. Built by factories, not by warriors. Yet the first real encounters began to challenge those assumptions in quiet, uncomfortable ways. American pilots did not always fly with elegance, but they flew with stubborn intent. They absorbed punishment, sometimes far more than Japanese pilots thought possible, and still tried to complete their missions. Word spread quickly among squadrons. One pilot told of shooting an American fighter until ammunition ran dry, only to see it wobble away and disappear into the clouds. Another described chasing a bomber that should have been finished. Watch crew members fire back even as flames crawled across the fuselage. These stories circulated in barracks, late at night, spoken softly because they conflicted with official doctrine. No one wanted to admit that the enemy was tougher than expected, but the sky itself was delivering that message with every engagement. Japanese pilots began to notice patterns. American flyers were not reckless in the way propaganda claimed. They avoided unnecessary risks, broke off when outmatched, and regrouped with precision. To a culture that prized the final, decisive clash, this behavior initially seemed dishonorable. But as losses mounted, some pilots started to see another interpretation. The Americans were not afraid of retreat because they expected to return. Survival was not shameful to them, it was practical. Each pilot who lived to fly again made the next battle more dangerous for everyone on the opposing side. There was also the matter of attitude. Captured Japanese airmen, who later heard accounts from American prisoners, were struck by their calm descriptions of combat. American pilots spoke of missions the way workers spoke of difficult jobs, dangerous, exhausting, but necessary. This mindset disturbed Japanese officers who believed that true warriors should burn with spiritual intensity. Yet, that very calm seemed to make Americans harder to break. They did not need to believe they were invincible. They believed they were replaceable, part of something larger. And that knowledge freed them from fear in a different way. As months passed, Japanese pilots began to privately reevaluate the enemy they faced. They noticed that Americans learned quickly. Tactics that worked once rarely worked again. When Japanese fighters tried to lure them into turning battles, Americans refused. When ambushes were prepared, Americans altered routes or arrived with escorts. This adaptability forced Japanese pilots to confront an uncomfortable truth. The enemy was studying them just as closely. The sky was becoming a classroom where mistakes were punished immediately, and the Americans seemed willing to discard pride in favor of survival. One veteran later recalled, the first time he truly respected an American pilot, it was not during a dramatic duel, but during a brief encounter at high altitude. His guns jammed mid-attack, and he expected the American to seize the opportunity. Instead, the American pilot broke away, choosing not to press the advantage recklessly. In that moment, respect replaced contempt. He fought to win the war, the Japanese pilot later said, not to win a moment. Despite this growing awareness, official rhetoric remained unchanged. Newspapers and radio broadcasts continued to describe American pilots as decadent and poorly trained. But in cockpits and maintenance tents, the truth was harder to ignore. Japanese pilots could feel the shift in momentum even before maps and casualty lists confirmed it. American formations grew larger. Their escort stayed longer. Their confidence was visible in the way they held course under fire, trusting their comrades and their machine. The machines themselves became part of the psychological battle. American aircraft were not graceful, but they were rugged. Japanese pilots saw planes return to carriers riddled with holes, engines sputtering, pilots wounded yet alive. Each survival was a silent statement. This enemy planned not only to fight, but to endure. That endurance contrasted sharply with Japan's emphasis on sacrifice. Many Japanese pilots began to wonder, privately and painfully, whether survival might sometimes be more powerful than death. As the war dragged on, fatigue set in. Experienced Japanese pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced, while American pilots rotated home, trained others, and returned with even greater skill. This cycle became impossible to ignore. Japanese veterans later admitted that by mid-war, they no longer underestimated American pilots. They feared them not as individuals, but as a system. Every American pilot in the sky represented factories, training schools, supply chains, and a national commitment that seemed endless. Yet, even in fear, there was recognition. Some Japanese pilots spoke of Americans with a tone that bordered on admiration. They respected their discipline, their loyalty to wingmen, and their refusal to abandon damaged comrades. In rare quiet moments, a few even wondered what it would be like to fight alongside such men instead of against them. These thoughts were never spoken aloud, but they lingered unspoken between the roar of engines and the silence after combat. By the time the tide of war clearly turned, many Japanese pilots understood something their leaders never publicly admitted. The Americans in the sky were not the enemy they had been taught to hate. They were professionals, shaped by a different culture but driven by the same desire to protect their own. That realization did not make defeat easier, but it made it clearer, and long after the war ended, when survivors looked back on those early encounters, they remembered that first moment of confusion. The burning aircraft that refused to fall, and recognized it as the moment when illusion died and reality took its place. Years later, that pilot would still hear the echo of engines when he closed his eyes, remembering how certainty dissolved into doubt in a single burning spiral. He understood then that wars are decided first in the mind, when myths collapse under experience. From that day forward, every American silhouette in the distance carried weight, not contempt. The sky had taught him a lesson no classroom ever could, one written in smoke and metal, telling him the enemy was real, capable, and unwilling to vanish quietly. This realization followed him through every flight afterward, and reshaped understanding of victory forever. Respect grew reluctantly, often dragged into existence by bitter losses and empty seats in briefing rooms. At first, Japanese pilots resisted the idea that admiration could coexist with enmity. They told themselves that American successes were accidents, that luck and numbers explained everything. Yet combat has a way of stripping excuses bare. Each encounter carved new doubts into old beliefs. American pilots did not behave like men chasing glory. They behaved like men executing a plan, and that distinction slowly rewired how Japanese aviators interpreted the sky around them. In early engagements, Japanese pilots still trusted their traditional advantages. Their aircraft could turn tighter, climb faster, and respond with a sensitivity that felt almost alive. Against inexperienced Americans, this worked, but the victories were fleeting. American pilots adjusted with unnerving speed. They stopped turning. They climbed less. They used altitude, speed, and coordination instead of finesse. To Japanese pilots raised on individual mastery, this felt wrong, almost insulting, but it was effective. And effectiveness has a way of commanding respect even when pride resists it. Stories began circulating about American wingmen who refused to abandon each other. If one plane was damaged, another stayed close, sometimes flying slower than safety allowed, just to ensure their partner made it home. Japanese pilots noticed how rarely Americans broke formation under pressure. Even when attacked, they maneuvered as a unit. creating overlapping fields of fire that punished lone attackers. This forced Japanese aces, once accustomed to single combat, into increasingly dangerous situations where skill alone was no longer enough. One veteran later recalled how strange it felt to fight an enemy who did not seem interested in proving anything. American pilots did not chase kills. They chased objectives. Bombers were protected at all costs, even if it meant ignoring tempting targets. To Japanese pilots trained to seek decisive moments, this approach seemed almost cold. Yet that coldness translated into consistency, and consistency translated into survival. Over time, Japanese airmen realized that American pilots were fighting a different kind of war, one measured not in individual victories but in cumulative pressure. As losses mounted, comparisons became unavoidable. Japanese training produced elite pilots, but replacements were rushed and inexperienced. American training, by contrast, emphasized repetition, procedure, and standardization. Japanese pilots noticed that even newcomers flew predictably, reliably, as if guided by an invisible script. That predictability, far from being a weakness, made them dependable. In battle, dependability mattered more than brilliance. A dependable wingman kept you alive longer than a brilliant one who chased personal triumph. There was also the unsettling reality of American abundance. Japanese pilots watched the skies fill with more aircraft than they thought possible. Damaged American planes disappeared from combat, only to reappear weeks later, repaired or replaced. Each return felt like a reminder that the enemy's strength did not depend on individual survival. American pilots could afford to withdraw, to regroup, to live. That freedom changed how they fought. They were aggressive but not desperate. And desperation, Japanese pilots knew, was the most dangerous fuel of all. Captured diaries and post-war testimonies revealed another layer of perception. Japanese pilots were struck by the professionalism Americans displayed even after losing comrades. Grief was present, but it did not paralyze operations. Missions continued. Training continued. The machine moved forward. This contrasted sharply with the Japanese experience, where the loss of seasoned pilots left emotional and tactical voids that could not be easily filled. Slowly, a painful understanding emerged. American strength lay not in any single pilot, but in the system that shaped and sustained them. As combat intensified, Japanese pilots began adjusting their language. They stopped calling Americans careless. They called them methodical. They stopped mocking their reliance on machines. They acknowledged how well those machines were used. Some even admitted, in private, that American aircraft design reflected their pilots' mindset: rugged, forgiving, built to keep men alive rather than to extract the last ounce of performance. This philosophy, once dismissed as weakness, now looked uncomfortably wise. There were moments of reluctant admiration in the heat of battle. A Japanese pilot might see an American hold formation through anti-aircraft fire, or watch a bomber crew fight flames long enough to clear friendly ships below. These moments left impressions that propaganda could not erase. They suggested that courage took many forms, not all of them dramatic or suicidal. Courage could be disciplined, calculated, and patient. By the later stages of the war, Japanese pilots openly acknowledged the shift in power dynamics. Even if they could not speak it publicly, American pilots controlled the pace of engagements. They chose when to fight and when to withdraw. Japanese pilots reacted rather than dictated. This reversal carried psychological weight. The sky no longer felt like a proving ground. It felt like contested territory slipping away. Yet respect did not erase resentment. Many Japanese pilots felt trapped between admiration for the enemy and loyalty to their own cause. They recognized American competence while mourning their own diminishing resources. This internal conflict followed them into every sortie. They fought harder, not because they believed victory was assured, but because pride demanded resistance, even when logic warned otherwise. In quiet moments after missions, surviving Japanese pilots reflected on what they had witnessed. They spoke of Americans as relentless rather than fearless, coordinated rather than inspired. They acknowledged that teamwork had replaced individual valor as the defining feature of air combat. This realization marked a cultural fracture. The war in the sky was no longer about heroic duels. It was about systems colliding, and the American system was proving heavier, steadier, and increasingly unstoppable. By the time Japanese pilots fully grasped this truth, it was too late to change course. The respect they felt for American pilots was tinged with regret, not for fighting them, but for underestimating them for so long. Each American plane overhead became a reminder that wars are not won by belief alone, but by preparation, cooperation, and the relentless willingness to learn. Survivors later admitted that facing Americans forced them to abandon comforting illusions about destiny and honor. The sky rewarded preparation, patience, and numbers more than purity of spirit. That truth lingered painfully, because it suggested defeat was structural, not moral. Accepting this did not erase pride, but it replaced denial with sober respect, leaving memories shaped less by hatred and more by the hard clarity of experience. These reflections remained long after uniforms were gone, quietly influencing how veterans spoke about the war and how they measured courage in hindsight, with fewer illusions and deeper understanding earned through loss alone. By the final years of the war, the tone among surviving Japanese pilots had changed so completely that it barely resembled the confidence they once carried into combat. What replaced it was not simple fear, but a layered understanding shaped by exhaustion, experience, and loss. American pilots were no longer spoken of as an abstract enemy. They were discussed as professionals whose presence reshaped every decision in the cockpit. Even before engines started, Japanese pilots considered what the Americans might do, not what doctrine suggested they should do. That shift alone revealed how deeply perceptions had evolved. Japanese veterans later recalled that American pilots seemed emotional, distant in combat, and this unsettled them more than aggression ever had. Americans attacked without visible rage, defended without hesitation, and disengaged without shame. To Japanese pilots raised on the belief that spirit should burn brightly in battle, this calm efficiency felt unnatural. Yet it was precisely the emotional distance that made American pilots so effective. They were not fighting for a moment of honor. They were fighting to complete missions, protect comrades, and survive to fly again. One recurring memory shared by Japanese survivors was the image of American formations advancing through heavy fire without breaking. Planes were hit, smoke trailed for engines, yet the formation held long enough to release bombs accurately before withdrawing in order. Japanese pilots understood how difficult that discipline was. Holding formation while under attack required trust, training, and acceptance that individual survival depended on collective action. In that realization, admiration quietly replaced earlier contempt. As Japan's resources dwindled, the contrast became even sharper. Fuel shortages, limited training, replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours and less confidence. Against them stood American pilots who rotated home, rested, trained others, and returned sharpened rather than depleted. Japanese veterans later described this as fighting an enemy that grew stronger with time, while they themselves grew thinner, slower, and more isolated. The American pilot was no longer just a man in the sky. He was the visible edge of an entire nation's capacity to sustain war. Some Japanese pilots admitted that what frightened them most was not American firepower, but American predictability. Once Americans identified a successful tactic, they repeated it relentlessly. There was no dramatic flourish, no theatrical bravado, just steady pressure applied day after day. Japanese pilots found it difficult to counter an enemy that did not seek surprise for its own sake, but relied on overwhelming consistency. Every mission felt like pushing against a tide that never stopped advancing. In the final months, respect became intertwined with sorrow. Japanese pilots mourned comrades lost not only to enemy action, but to the growing impossibility of victory. They recognized that American pilots were not monsters nor supermen, but individuals shaped by a system that valued survival and learning. This recognition humanized the enemy in ways that propaganda never allowed. Some veterans later confessed that this understanding made combat more painful, not less. It is easier to hate a caricature than to fight a mirror of disciplined resolve. After the war, when Japanese pilots spoke openly, their reflections were marked by honesty rather than bitterness. They acknowledged American courage, but defined it differently than their own. American courage lay in restraint, coordination, and endurance. It lay in the willingness to trust systems, leaders, and fellow pilots. Japanese veterans contrasted this with their own experience, where courage often demanded finality. In hindsight, some wondered whether survival itself might have been the more powerful form of bravery. Meetings between former enemies in the post-war years further reshaped these memories. Japanese pilots who met American counterparts were often surprised by their humility. Many Americans spoke openly about fear, mistakes, and luck. This candor reinforced what Japanese pilots had sensed during the war. American pilots were not driven by fantasies of invincibility. They expected danger and prepared for it methodically. That expectation, rather than blind confidence, had carried them through. As years passed, the memories sharpened instead of fading. Japanese veterans no longer described the war in terms of who was right or wrong in the sky. They described it in terms of lessons learned too late. They spoke of American pilots as adversaries who forced them to confront the limits of tradition when faced with modern industrial warfare. The sky had become a proving ground, not of spirit alone, but of adaptability. What endured most strongly was the image of American aircraft pressing forward through smoke, flak, and resistance, not recklessly but deliberately. That image symbolized a mindset Japanese pilots came to respect deeply. The belief that persistence, cooperation, and survival were not signs of weakness, but of strategic strength. It was a belief that reshaped air combat and ultimately the outcome of the war. In the quiet years that followed, Japanese pilots carried these reflections with them. They taught younger generations not only how battles were fought, but how assumptions can blind even the most skilled warriors. They spoke of the Americans they faced not with hatred, but with clarity. And in that clarity lay the true ending of the story, a recognition that the men they fought in the sky were shaped by a different philosophy, one that valued coming home alive so the fight could continue. That philosophy, once dismissed, proved decisive, and in acknowledging it, Japanese pilots finally closed the chapter of the war, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Time softened anger but sharpened insight, allowing veterans to speak without slogans. They understood that their enemy had never been weak, only different. Remembering this brought a strange peace, because it transformed suffering into knowledge. In accepting that truth, many found closure, honoring fallen comrades while acknowledging the skill and resolve of those once faced across the clouds. Those memories became lessons passed quietly to future generations of pilots and historians alike, so that conflict might be remembered honestly, rather than glorified blindly, with humility, reflection, and an enduring respect for reality born from experience, not myth or illusion alone.